Hello and welcome to Module 4.2 of Ancient Civilizations. Today we're going to look at the Polytheistic Ennead, a group of gods of ancient Egypt. Now, some notable locations and dates that I would have you put on your timeline or your maps include Thebes, Memphis, Heliopolis. Notable dates are that of the Old, Middle, and New Kingdom. You should have these dates from our previous examination of the expansion of Egypt in Unit 2. But if not, feel free to add them. And as we go through this video, feel free to pause, stop, rewind me so we can kind of move at your own pace. Now, where do we start? Ancient Egypt is similar to a lot of other civilizations in the sense that it's trying to really explain the unexplainable and a lot of different phenomena that they just can't seem to put their finger on. So what they do is they come up with elaborate stories and mythologies to kind of explain these phenomena. Now, in terms of kind of religious tradition, questions that they consider, and people today still consider these same questions, is what is faith? You know, is it really all that important? How does it influence the individual? And what would a world without faith look like? Let's take a look at what the Egyptians did and thought. Now, the majority of ancient belief systems are polytheistic, meaning that there are many gods that are presented. Now, Egypt is a great example of henotheism. And henotheism is a belief that acknowledges many other gods, but they worship one deity as the supreme god or the supreme being. Okay? The 9 gods that are going to play instrumental and critical roles in Egyptian religion are the Ennead, which means the 9. Okay? And we'll talk about those 9 gods and kind of what role they played in the formation of Egyptian religion and such. Now, looking at this graphic, you can see that we have the 9. There's actually 10, but we'll talk about the 10th one. But there's 9 primary gods. Okay, you have Atum here. A lot of times he is represented here as the sun, with hands that kind of are stretched out here, meaning that he's giving life and creating life. Then you have Shu and Tefnut that are created by him. And yes, they're brother and sister, and yes, they're husband and wife, and we'll get to that and what that means for pharaohs and leaders of Egypt in the ancient world. And they have 2 children. They have Nut and they have Geb. Now, what's interesting to note here is that they kind of follow in their parents' example of getting married and having children, and Shu is not so cool with that. So Shu steps in and he separates Geb from Nut. And this is a lot of times why you see Geb down here, and he's going to represent the earth, and there's a separation between him and the sky. This is kind of that eternal punishment for what they did. Now, before they're separated, Geb has 4 children: Osiris, Isis, Nephthys, and Seth. Now, one thing to note is that eventually you're going to have another deity that comes into play that has an instrumental role, and his name is Horus. Horus is going to be the son of Osiris and Isis, and we'll talk about his importance and what he does here later on in this video. Now, the creation of these gods has kind of an interesting backstory, and I've embedded this video here, and just for the sake of time, what I'd like you guys to do is go to that video and watch this, and you can see the mythology that exists with the creation of these gods, and subsequently the creation of humans, according to this line of Egyptian lore. So it's a 3-minute video, it's quick. Please check that out before we go any further. Okay, now that you're back from watching the video, well, let's look at the Godhead. Now, Egyptians, like the Sumerians and like other civilizations, believe that deities played a prominent role within the world in earthly affairs. The principal gods that we see in Egypt are Amun and Ra. Now, Amun was originally a Theban deity. Okay, you can look at your map that's associated with the Egyptian world to locate where that's at. And Ra was a sun god worshipped at a different city, Heliopolis. Now, during the Old Kingdom, priests combined these gods together, and so they formed the cult of Amun-Ra. That's what's interesting about the Egyptian god and pantheon and hierarchy of these gods, is that they just keep kind of adding gods to the mix. You got to remember that Egyptian history, especially in the ancient sense, was a very long-lasting civilization. So there's a lot of changes and amendments and adaptations to this religious pantheon. It's kind of confusing. Now, what's interesting also to look at is the uniformity of the gods between different civilizations. So feel free to pause it and take a look at this, but you can see here with the king of the gods, or the supreme god, and where they kind of compare from Mesopotamia to Egypt to Greece and Rome. And a lot of them are going to be very similar, and some of them are the same person altogether. But we don't see a lot of variety. So that pantheon, or this polytheistic hierarchy, is similar, really, until we get to the monotheistic faiths. And we'll talk about those later this unit. Now, the first pharaoh, the first king, is Osiris. Now, a lot of times he's going to be portrayed as green, and this is because Osiris is going to be the god of the earth and a god of vegetation. And he's green because he represents rebirth. Just like when the spring comes around, plants and trees and all that kind of stuff, for the most part, you see this green emergence, kind of covers the landscape. Now, he's going to be the first to give Egypt civilization. Like we talked about, he's the first ruler of Egypt. Eventually, he's going to be overtaken and killed by his brother Seth because he's jealous of his power and his position. Now, today, what we see in a lot of modern hieroglyphics, or hieroglyphics in a modern sense, is that Osiris is portrayed up here like this, and he is mummified. And that really denotes that he is the king or the ruler of the underworld. And he's going to judge the dead and those that are trying to get into an afterlife. Now, the story of Osiris, I'm going to give you kind of a synopsis here, but there's also an article that I want you to read as well. It's published on the module for 4.2. Now, like we talked about, Osiris' evil brother Seth, he murdered him and scattered his dismembered parts throughout Egypt. Okay, and you can kind of see that in this caricature here of Seth doing this. Now, what's weird in this story is that his wife Isis is going to retrieve these body parts, and she's going to give them a proper burial. In some senses, you'll see that she actually was able to kind of put these parts back together, except for one primary body part. And she's going to eventually fashion that out of clay or gold, depending on which story you look at. And once that's put back in place, she is going to have a son with her husband. Okay, and that child is going to be Horus. And Horus is going to make a critical change to the balance of power in this storyline. Now, when Osiris does come back, or the gods kind of bring him back, depending on what you look at, he is going to become the king of the underworld. And we'll look at a video later on in this lesson that will showcase kind of what his role is in the afterlife. Now, like we talked about, Horus was born to Isis after she reconfigures Osiris's body parts. He is going to avenge his father's death by killing his uncle Seth in certain accounts. Now, he is going to become the ruler or protector of Egypt throughout kind of various dynasties. And a lot of times you're going to see the Eye of Horus as a symbol of protection and royal power in hieroglyphics and throughout pyramids and in other structures throughout ancient Egyptian history. Now, like we talked about, the gods were kind of the example that humans followed. And so what we see is that a lot of how ancient Egypt was run was theocratic, meaning that theo meaning God, and then the theocratic is just a government structure. So it's a government that has a religious figure at the top of the social structure. And this is what you would see with the pharaoh on top, would have a divine status or interpret the messages of the gods. And then you would have power that would be distributed from a few to the many down here, eventually going to, or from government officials to soldiers to scribes to merchants to craftspeople, peasants, and finally slaves. I like this. If you get a chance to look at this on the notes or pause this, this is kind of a relevant social pyramid or social hierarchy of how things were constructed in ancient Egypt. And you might get a kick out of looking at some of these little paragraphs here, because they kind of put their positions and their responsibilities in a language that you can better understand. Now, we could talk about gods of ancient Egypt till the end of this class if we needed to, because they're going to worship over 1,500 gods, and they're going to keep just kind of adding gods into the mix. Now, why animals? This is a question that I get fairly often with the Egyptian gods. And now, when we talked about the origins of Egypt, initially we looked at they were small little tribes that, because the Sahara, because of climate change, was drying up, they were coming together and they were having a process of cultural diffusion. Now, each village would have had its own like animal deity, kind of like its own mascot, if you will, and they would have been identified by that logo, so to speak. So what happens is, when they come together, each Egyptian nome or district is going to bring their own totem or their own hierarchy of these gods. And eventually these hierarchies are going to be pushed together, and they're going to form the gods that we see today within ancient Egypt, that have different roles and responsibilities within society. Now, to change gears just a little bit, we have the Egyptian afterlife, and what happens here is that the spirit is going to be, or have the opportunity to go to an afterlife. Now, in Egyptian afterlife, there is a process of judgment, and I want to walk you through what this looks like right here. These hieroglyphics illustrate what this process is. Now, typically the deceased, in a spiritual sense, would come here and they would proclaim that they were true of voice, meaning that they hadn't done anything wrong, and they would have testified before, I think, just over 40-some gods, that they hadn't committed any sin or anything like that. And once they were found to be suitable to progress, what they would have done is been led through the underworld by Anubis. Okay, they would have gone here, and this is an important part of the afterlife process. This is called the weighing of the heart ceremony. Now, the Egyptians thought that they were, or the heart was kind of the root of what we tend to associate the brain with its powers and responsibilities or whatnot. So what they would do is they would weigh the heart, if it was full of sin or justice, against Ma'at, which was the feather of justice. So, to make a long story short, if the heart was heavy with sin, this animal right here, called Ammit the gobbler, he would eat your heart, and you would no longer exist. But if the feather was heavier than the heart, which meant your heart was pure, you would have went on and you would have faced judgment, kind of with Osiris. And again, Osiris is depicted here as the king of the underworld in green and mummified. So what we're going to do is I want you to take a look at this afterlife process in a little further sense, and we're going to watch a video called Egyptian Secrets of the Afterlife. And if you have a Netflix account, you can access it by means of that medium as well. But this is going to kind of travel or take us on a further in-depth examination of what the Egyptian afterlife would have looked like, or what they believed it would have looked like. Okay? Thanks for tuning in. I appreciate it. We'll see you tomorrow.